There are always faces in history that we never see, and gazes from which there is no escape. Imagine this. You stand before Darius the Great, King of Kings, a man whose shadow is longer than the Persian Empire itself. Every breath you take here is an event for the scribes, every movement, a potential crime against an order where even the walls know how to report you. In this palace, everything has a price: words, glances, mistakes, even memories. Here, gold is not wealth, but proof of obedience. A smile is a tool of suspicion, and silence weighs more than any offering. Before you stands a man who ruled the world, but could never find peace in any of his own palaces. You stand in the heart of an ancient machine of power, where any moment can become eternity. And if you think that history is just a story of victories and heroics, you simply have never stood before someone who never sleeps, because history itself lives behind his eyes. But before you settle in, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I'm genuinely curious to see who's joined us. Now get comfortable. We're about to begin. You do not know if you are allowed to breathe. There is a certain etiquette to standing before the King of Kings. Do not look too long. Do not look away too quickly. Never show teeth unless specifically requested. But there is something else, something unsaid, a tension in the room that is thicker than incense, heavier than the golden bracelets on Darius's wrists. He studies you, not just your face, but your hands. You try to keep them still, but already your palms are sweaty, the skin betraying the ball lives you have lived before this audience. Darius's gaze lingers, almost curious, almost clinical. He sees no calluses, no scars, no proof of a life spent in war or labor. Your fingers are not those of a soldier, nor a farmer. Perhaps you are nothing, or in this palace, perhaps that is a kind of threat. His lips curl, not into a snarl, but into a smile so slight and crooked that you almost miss it. There is nothing warm in it. It is the smile of a man who has learned to make 1,000 enemies every year and has survived each one. The smile says, I have seen every trick, every lie, every trembling supplicant. Impress me if you dare. One of his satraps, who seems carved from stone and possibly even colder, leans close and murmurs something in Old Persian. Darius gives a single nod. You imagine that nod echoing down the length of 1,000 miles, through rivers, cities, and deserts. A nod from Darius can mean the building of a palace, the destruction of a family, the invention of a law, the end of a dream. But today, it simply means that you will hear a story. Darius speaks, and his voice carries the weight of an empire, or at least the weight of a man who believes he deserves one. He begins not with threats, not with demands, but with a fact as dry and irrefutable as the Persian sun. There was a time, he says, when I was nothing. You try not to show surprise. It is hard to imagine Darius as anything but the King of Kings, with servants and generals and tax collectors orbiting him like nervous moons. But he continues, each word deliberate and heavy, as if he is laying bricks for a new palace. Once I was neither king nor prince. I was a soldier, a body among bodies, a name in a scroll so long that even my father could not find me. This is the story everyone knows, or thinks they know, but hearing it in Darius's own voice is different. You remember scraps from the market, whispered by old men between cups of sour wine. Darius was not born to the throne. Darius did not inherit his greatness. He stole it, as all true greatness is stolen. The details, as always, are more embarrassing than glorious. Cambyses, the king before Darius, went mad, or at least mad enough to die. His brother Bardia, or someone pretending to be Bardia, for in the Persian court, everyone is someone pretending to be someone else, seized the throne. The empire, this sprawling, multilingual, tax riddled machine, wobbled, uncertain. Here, Darius pauses, as if savoring the memory of a world briefly without an owner. He glances at you, as if wondering how much of this you already know. 6 men joined me, he says. 6 men and 6 knives. We crept through the palace like rats. We did what had to be done. He does not describe the blood. He does not need to. You have heard enough to imagine the scene. The false king, surprised in his chambers, the long knives, the short cries, the satisfaction of a deed done and never forgotten. Later, poets will polish the story, turning murder into destiny. But here, in this hall, with Darius's eyes on you, there is no poetry, only the sharp truth of steel in the dark. You wonder if you should be frightened. After all, you are in the presence of a man who gained an empire by stabbing it awake. But there is something oddly reassuring in his honesty. Darius does not pretend he was chosen by the gods. He admits that he was chosen by fear, by violence, by the randomness of being the last one standing. And if there is a lesson here, it is that all kings begin as gamblers, and all gamblers end as kings or ghosts. Darius looks away for the first time, scanning the faces of his court. You see the satraps tense, as if bracing for some invisible storm. He continues, almost idly, the empire is not built of stone, it is built of stories. The story of how you rise is always rewritten by those who survive. The court is silent, but in that silence you sense a collective exhale, each person remembering their own story, their own moment of almost death or almost glory. In Persia, memory is a weapon and forgetting is a crime. Darius looks back at you. What story will you tell when you leave this hall? He asks. You do not know how to answer. You suspect the correct response is always silence. As if sensing your uncertainty, he waves a hand. No matter, the story will be told with or without you. His tone is flat, unhurried. The golden bracelets on his wrist gleam in the sun. The smile returns, thinner than a dagger's edge. You realize, with a chill, that you are not only being measured, you are being added to the endless catalog of stories that make up the empire. In some dusty scroll, perhaps, a scribe will record, on the 12th day of the month, a stranger stood before Darius and failed to be interesting. Around you, the court resumes its usual rhythm. A nod here, a shuffle of sandals there, the flicker of torchlight on patterned tiles. The world continues, but something has changed. You know more now, not just about Darius, but about power itself. Power is the art of making other people remember your version of the story. Darius turns away, his interest spent for now. The satraps close ranks. The soldiers remain motionless, each a monument to obedience and caution. You are left alone with your hands, your thoughts, and the knowledge that in this palace, to be unremarkable is almost a kind of mercy. You exhale quietly. For the briefest moment, you feel almost grateful to be nothing. It is not easy to relax under the gaze of the King of Kings, even when he is momentarily distracted by something more interesting than your trembling hands. You would think that standing in the hall of Darius would make you feel small, but instead it has the opposite effect. It makes you keenly, unbearably aware of every inch of your own body, every bead of sweat, every half remembered fact about the man in front of you. But then, for a moment, the king seems to forget about you. His interest shifts elsewhere, and you are left with time, too much time to look around. The palace is enormous, yet there is something about it that feels like a trap disguised as a masterpiece. Maybe it is the doors, so many of them, leading to so many places, all equally unwelcoming. Maybe it is the fact that there are more guards here than columns, and there are a lot of columns. A minor official steps forward, clearing his throat. You realize that here, in Persepolis, clearing your throat might be a capital offense if you do it at the wrong moment. But this man seems practiced in the art of not being noticed until he wants to be. He is short, careful, the color of his robes somewhere between dust and resignation. He addresses you without looking directly at you, as if eye contact were an unnecessary luxury. His Majesty, the official murmurs, requests that you take note of the wonders of the empire. They say that to know Persia is to know its roads. You nod, unsure if a nod is sufficient, but no one beheads you. This, you think, is progress. The official begins to explain at the measured, ponderous pace that marks all imperial explanations that Persia is, in fact, a network more than a nation. The empire is built not on blood, not on gold, not even on the bones of conquered cities, but on roads. You cannot help but picture them. Thin, stubborn veins stretching from one horizon to the other, all converging on you like you are at the heart of a living, breathing organism. The royal road, he says, is the pride of the empire. From Sardis to Susa, nearly 2,500 kilometers, patrolled by couriers and soldiers who never sleep, never smile, and never, ever lose a message. The couriers are so reliable that if a man dies on the road, they say the message will arrive before his body is even cold. It is hard to care about infrastructure when you are this close to fainting, but the official persists as if reading from a sacred script. The King of Kings does not merely rule cities, he rules travel itself. Movement is a privilege. Every step you take is permitted, calculated, recorded. Even standing here, you are standing because someone allowed you to stand. You begin to wonder if the ground beneath your feet belongs to you or if it is borrowed from the empire to be reclaimed at any moment. The official, apparently warming to his theme, moves on to the subject of water. His Majesty, he says, is also the master of canals. There is none greater than the canal from the Nile to the Red Sea, which he ordered dug by the hands of 10,000 laborers, each one less enthusiastic than the last. He pauses, perhaps to let you imagine 10,000 men with aching backs and sand in their eyes carving a scar across the land because a man in a palace had a vision of ships passing between Egypt and Persia. The canal, the official insists, is not merely a convenience, it is a statement. It says, even the land itself will obey the will of Darius. Rivers will change direction if necessary. The world is not a collection of obstacles. It is an assortment of tasks awaiting completion, preferably by someone else. You realize, with a dull sense of irony, that Darius has built a world in which no one can escape him. The roads will always lead back to Persepolis. The canals will always carry the news of your deeds or failures back to the King of Kings, faster than regret or hope. You begin to understand why the empire seems both vast and claustrophobic. There are no true frontiers, only more checkpoints. The official finishes his speech with a small, polite cough, as if apologizing for the empire's efficiency. His Majesty's greatness, he concludes, is measured not only in conquered lands, but in the time it takes to send a message to every corner of the world, and the certainty that the message will be obeyed. As he withdraws, you notice the way the guard's eyes follow him. No one is above suspicion, not even the men whose job it is to sing the praises of the empire. In Persia, praise is a dangerous occupation. There are always new roads, new canals, new reasons to be missed or forgotten. Suddenly, Darius's voice cuts through your thoughts, low and almost amused. Do you see? He asks, gesturing to the intricate map on the wall, a web of roads, a tangle of lines, each more ambitious than the last. Every road begins somewhere and ends somewhere else. The secret, he says with that crooked smile again, is making sure that every road ends here. You look at the map, you look at the king. For a moment, you feel yourself shrinking until you are no more than a dot at the center of a sprawling empire. It is a peculiar sensation, not fear, not awe, but a weary kind of inevitability, as if, no matter how far you travel, you will always find yourself standing before Darius the Great, with no one to save you but your own clever silence. You stand very still, wondering whether you will ever see the end of the road. The official disappears as quietly as he arrived, and for a moment you are left with only the sound of your own pulse and the distant murmur of sandals on polished stone. The air remains heavy, laced with the scent of burnt resin, which, you realize, is only barely strong enough to cover the lingering odor of something far less pleasant: fear. You try to study the walls without being obvious about it. They are covered in images, all meticulously arranged, each telling a piece of a much larger, more menacing story. The most striking among them are the lions. Hundreds of lions, maybe thousands, pacing across the glazed bricks in endless procession, claws extended, jaws open, muscles taut in a perpetual leap that will never land. You ask yourself, not for the first time, why the Persians love their lions so much. What is it about these beasts that warrants such obsessive display? A voice near your shoulder supplies the answer before you can frame the question aloud. Lions are hungry, the voice says, low and deliberate, as though reciting a proverb meant only for the unlucky. You glance sideways to find another satrap standing close enough to catch your shiver. This one is older, his eyes sharp and tired, his beard more salt than pepper. A lion that stops hunting starves. Here, we remind ourselves never to grow comfortable. You nod, wondering if this is wisdom or merely a justification for anxiety. But then you realize in Persia, anxiety is wisdom. You look again at the lions, and you see it now: not glory, not majesty, but a constant warning. There is no feast that will last forever. The satrap gestures with a ring heavy hand toward a different set of images. Less decorative, more functional. There, painted on wooden panels, is a map. Not a beautiful one, not the sort that impresses with its artistry, but a blunt, practical thing, divided into neat, almost surgical slices. Satrapies, the satrap says, are empire's arteries. The king cannot watch every field, so he divides the fields into pieces and sets a trusted man, well, a somewhat trusted man, in charge of each. You try to count the divisions, but the map defeats you with its sheer number of borders and subdivisions, each with names that sound like curses in languages you do not know. The satraps, you learn, are not simply governors. They are tax collectors, judges, generals, executioners, and when necessary, scapegoats. The King of Kings does not rule by kindness. He rules by ensuring that every man with power is too afraid of the next man with power to ever become comfortable. Divide and rule, the satrap says, with the air of someone explaining the punchline of a joke that no one is supposed to laugh at. Each satrapy is given just enough authority to be useful and just enough suspicion to be harmless. If a satrap grows too rich, the king sends auditors. If a satrap grows too popular, the king sends a poet to write a tragedy about his life. If a satrap grows too quiet, well, then the king begins to worry. You try not to let your face betray your thoughts. It is suddenly clear that the empire is not a pyramid, as the old stories say, but a nest of vipers, each one so concerned with the bite of its neighbor that no one ever sleeps deeply. The satrap steps closer, lowering his voice even further. Do you know why the taxes are counted 3 times? He asks. You shake your head, unsure if this is a riddle or a trap. It is not for accuracy, he says, almost smiling. It is for humiliation. The first count is to show you are trusted. The second, to show you are not. The third, to remind you that your worth is measured by what you can give and by how well you can endure being doubted. It occurs to you that everything in Persia is ritualized suspicion. The taxes are not about revenue. The satrapies are not about efficient administration. The lions on the walls are not about pride. They are warnings, reminders to keep your claws out and your enemies closer. As you listen, the palace shifts around you. What once seemed grand now feels oppressive. The beautiful columns resemble bars. The elaborate tiles seem less like decoration and more like a series of coded messages. You begin to understand that in this place, every wall has ears, every smile has teeth, and every job, from king to cook, is temporary. In the distance, you hear laughter, thin and cold, echoing through the corridors. You realize it comes from the direction of the treasury, where the tax collectors practice their own kind of worship, counting and recounting, making and unmaking fortunes with a few marks of ink. The satrap leans back, his voice returning to the tone of lazy, lethal calm. Welcome to the Empire, he says. Here, every man is a lion, every satrapy is a cage, and every story is a warning. You want to laugh, but your mouth is dry. Instead, you nod, as if you have learned something worth knowing. In the shadow of the lions, you feel a strange comfort. After all, in a kingdom of suspicion, even fear can become familiar. You are quickly learning that in this palace, everything is a performance. The guards stand not simply to guard, but to be seen standing. The lions prowl not simply for pride, but to show that there is always something hungry in the walls. Even the officials seem to move as if they are part of an invisible dance, each step careful, each gesture practiced. Now you are summoned to a side chamber, a low ceilinged room with narrow windows and a table so wide you wonder how anyone reaches across it. Here sits another satrap, this one as gaunt as famine, with fingers stained by ink and, you suspect, guilt. His smile is thin, and his eyes are weighed down by the calculations of 1,000 unhappy villages. He motions for you to sit. You do, awkwardly. It is not clear whether this is an interrogation or a lesson. Let me tell you about justice, the satrap begins, his voice as flat as the plains east of Susa. In Persia, justice is measured in gold, if you are lucky, in wheat, if you are not, in heads, if you are very, very unlucky. You try to look interested, but not too interested, which in itself is a talent. He reaches into a clay jar and produces a handful of gold coins. He drops them on the table with the kind of casual care that only comes from knowing they do not belong to you. Every year, every satrapy must pay tribute. Gold, silver, livestock, grain, carpets, sometimes even children who can sing or run or count to 10 without lying. The king is generous. He takes whatever is valuable and decides what that is only after you have paid. The satrap explains, with grim satisfaction, how each satrapy is assessed, not by what it can give, but by what it cannot afford to lose. The king's men, he says, will walk your fields, count your cattle, measure your grain. Then they will tell you that you have lied, no matter what you have shown them. You will pay what they demand, and you will thank them for not taking more. He laughs. It is not a pleasant sound. If your tribute is light, the king suspects you are hiding something. If your tribute is heavy, he suspects you are growing too rich. There is no correct answer, only correct attitude. You are given a cup of water. It tastes of tin and anxiety. As you drink, the satrap continues. After the tribute is collected, it is weighed, first by the collector, then by the collector's superior, and finally by a man who is paid to find fault. This is the ritual of humiliation. By the time it reaches the treasury, your tribute has been handled so many times that even the gods cannot remember where it came from. He leans forward, lowering his voice. Let me give you a secret. No one here believes in fairness. Fairness is for Greeks. Here, we believe in endurance. If you can endure the process, you have earned the right to be taxed again next year. If not, your name is erased from the scrolls, and your village is planted with someone else's people. You are not sure if this is a joke or a warning, so you nod, hoping this is the right reaction. The satrap pushes a ledger toward you, pages covered in tiny, exacting script. Look, he says, each number is a life, each line a season of hunger or abundance. The king wants order, but order is expensive. Every tax paid is a lesson learned. Every lesson learned is a reason to doubt your neighbor. This is how we keep peace. You glance at the ledger, seeing not numbers but stories. The sudden loss of a herd, the disappearance of a son, the slow decline of a field grown too tired to resist. You wonder how many stories are ended with a mark in the wrong column. Do not pity the taxpayer, the satrap says, watching your face with sharp amusement. Pity the collector? The king changes collectors more often than he changes his mind. It is not safe to be the bearer of bad news. Sometimes the collector is punished for not collecting enough. Sometimes for collecting too much. Sometimes just for being remembered. There is a silence, heavy and expectant. You feel the weight of the room, the coins, the ink, the eyes. In Persia, you think everyone is taxed by the king, by their neighbors, by the grinding necessity of surviving in a world that never lets you forget who is watching. Finally, the satrap sits back, folding his hands. Remember this. In the empire, gold is not for spending. Gold is for measuring your obedience. If you run out, you have run out of favor. He smiles, thin and tired. You may go. You leave the room feeling both lighter and heavier than before. Behind you, the satrap counts his coins for the second time, and you know that before the sun sets, someone else will count them again. In the hallway, you pass another tax collector, his arms full of ledgers, his face pale with dread. You do not meet his eyes. Here, to see someone's fear is almost as dangerous as showing your own. As you walk back toward the main hall, you begin to understand. In the empire of Darius, nothing is given freely, and everything, including you, is weighed and counted, not once, not twice, but until the scales break and the story ends. You hear the word Babylon long before you see the man who speaks it. The name is passed from mouth to mouth, carried on a breath that seems to tremble with the weight of old disasters. You sense a tightening in the air, a subtle shift in the way the guards stand, as if they are bracing themselves against a storm that has already passed but never quite left. Soon you find yourself in a smaller, gloomier chamber, its walls thick with stories and the stubborn stains of old battles. The king is there, of course, his eyes a little darker, his patience thinner, as if memory itself has worn grooves into his face. Around him gather men who call themselves generals and men who call themselves survivors, and you are not always sure which title is more honest. Darius seems almost pleased to see you again, or perhaps he is simply pleased to have an audience. Babylon, he says, tasting the word as if it were sour, has a habit of forgetting who rules it. You nod, because this seems safe. You know the stories. Babylon, city of gods and rivers, walls so thick even arrogance cannot breach them. And yet somehow they have fallen again and again, never simply to swords, but to hunger, to betrayal, to the slow, methodical strangulation that is the Persian way of war. A general, his breastplate battered but his pride intact, begins to recount the latest revolt. They barred their gates, he says. They filled their granaries. They promised each other that this time, they would be free. He smiles, a slow, toothy thing that never quite reaches his eyes. But time belongs to the king, not to them. Darius gestures, and the general unrolls a scroll. Upon it, neat lines of script record the length of the siege, the number of arrows loosed, the names of the men who died, and the names of the men who will never be remembered. It is important to keep a record, Darius murmurs, almost to himself, so that every victory is measured, every defeat disguised. You try to picture it, Babylon behind its great walls, the river running thick and slow, its defenders dreaming of a freedom they have only heard about in songs. You imagine the hunger, the endless dust, the slow collapse of hope as week after week passes and the gates remain closed, but the city grows smaller inside itself. Do you know how to break a city? The general asks you, as if this is an everyday question. You shake your head. He laughs, short, sharp, the sound of a blade being drawn. You wait. You wait until the food runs out, until the songs stop, until the men start eyeing their neighbors instead of their enemies. You remind them that walls are only useful when the people behind them believe in them. Darius interjects with the weary authority of someone who has ordered too many sieges. But you must always finish with a show. There must be no doubt. When the walls fall, the punishment must be so memorable that the grandchildren will wake at night remembering the fear. He speaks of archers, hundreds, then thousands, lined up outside the walls, firing volley after volley, not just at men, but at the very idea of resistance. You imagine the sky blackened with arrows, the sound as relentless as rain, the knowledge that surrender will come, not because hope is lost, but because even despair has grown tired. A scribe steps forward, clutching a tablet covered in neat cuneiform. The king's arrows are the best in the world, he declares, voice trembling with a mixture of pride and terror. They say that when the archers bend their bows, even the sun hides. You glance at the men around you, the generals with their crooked grins, the scribes with their ink stained hands, the king with his polished calm, and you realize that here, war is not about courage or glory. War is an exercise in mathematics, a contest of patience, a demonstration of the empire's inexhaustible supply of men, arrows, and time. Darius looks at you, and for a moment, you see something like weariness in his eyes. You will hear that I am cruel, he says quietly, but cruelty is simply remembering what others wish to forget. Babylon will not rise again, not because I am merciful, but because I do not let them forget what happened when they tried. The general nods, as if this is both obvious and exhausting. You think of the archers, their spines bent from long days on the field, their fingers stained with bowstring and sweat, their faces burned by the same sun that, according to the scribe, has learned to hide. You wonder how many men are broken not by battle, but by the endless repetition of waiting, drawing, loosing, counting. A servant brings a bowl of water, and you drink, hoping to wash the taste of ashes from your mouth. Around you, the court moves on to the next subject, but you sense that the lesson is not over. In Persia, victories are never truly celebrated. They are simply recorded, counted, and stored away for the next revolt. As you leave the chamber, you pass a wall marked with notches, each one representing a siege, a battle, a city brought to heel. You pause, counting. When you reach the end, you realize there is always space for one more. You return to the palace corridors, haunted by the knowledge that here, memory is a weapon sharper than any arrow, and forgetting is a luxury that no one, certainly not you, can afford. As you leave behind the darkness of the chamber, still haunted by Babylon's defeat, the air in the next room strikes you as almost festive. Almost. You are ushered into a hall where long tables groan under the weight of dishes you cannot name, and where gold goblets catch the torchlight with such intensity that your eyes ache before you have even had a chance to drink. You are not alone. Satraps, generals, and ambassadors fill the benches, but none seem as comfortable as they pretend. All are waiting for someone to make the first mistake. Servants move quietly, their faces as blank as unmarked tablets, hands never idle. The scent of roasted lamb and unfamiliar spices tries to drown out the ever present whiff of anxiety. In the midst of it all, you see Darius, perched on a throne so small it seems to mock the size of his empire. He beckons, and a goblet is pressed into your hand. You do not know if you are supposed to drink, toast, or simply admire the cup, so you do all three as cautiously as possible. The wine is sharp, almost medicinal, with a bitterness that seems designed to remind you of your place. Darius raises his own goblet, and the room freezes. Let us drink, he says, to the peace we keep and the noise we endure. He does not smile, but the corners of his mouth twitch as if the phrase contains a private joke. Next to you, a satrap leans in. He smells of mint and apprehension. He means the Greeks, he whispers, eyes darting around the room. Whenever he mentions noise, he means the Greeks. You try to look wise. Everyone here seems to agree. The Greeks are a particularly sophisticated form of headache. In some ways, their mischief is almost admired. A people who can invent philosophy and insurrection in the same afternoon, who dance until dawn and argue until dusk, who see rules as personal insults. Darius does not hate the Greeks, not really. Hate would be too generous. Instead, he seems to find them deeply, existentially irritating, like a pebble in his sandal, like a song that will not leave his head. The Greeks are not the empire's greatest threat, they are its greatest inconvenience. He sets down his goblet and addresses the room. Our messengers have returned from Athens, he says, his tone flat. They bring tales of democracy. They say the people shout at one another until a decision is made. He lets the silence hang long enough for the absurdity to ferment in the air. A satrap attempts a diplomatic cough. Another ambassador, Lydian or Ionian, it is hard to tell, mutters something about spirited debate. Darius waves him off. They have many spirits, he says, none of them peaceful. You watch as a servant offers Darius a platter of figs, which he ignores. You sense that the king's real hunger is for something less digestible, respect, or maybe just quiet. The Greeks cannot be conquered, he muses aloud, only outlasted. They are like the wind, always finding new ways in, always refusing to stay where they are put. Someone at the table tries to flatter the king by recounting the failed Athenian rebellion, but Darius interrupts with a dismissive gesture. They rebel because they are bored. We rule because we are tired. A few nervous laughs ripple through the hall, quickly silenced by the king's glance. You sip your wine again, hoping the bitterness will dull your confusion. But the king is not finished. They sent us earth and water, he recalls, as tokens of submission. Do you know what I sent them in return? He pauses. Instructions. They ignored them, of course. The room sits in awkward silence, the memory of failed embassies and awkward negotiations thick in the air. You imagine Persian messengers trudging back from Greece, burdened with philosophical riddles and sunburn. their reports written in a tone that barely conceals exhaustion. Darius turns to you suddenly. "What do you think of the Greeks?" he asks, voice deceptively casual. You freeze. There are no safe answers. If you praise them, you are a traitor. If you insult them, you are uncultured. So you say what you hope is the safest possible thing. They are very lively, my king. Darius lets out a dry laugh, one that holds no real amusement. Lively, he repeats. Yes, like a fire in a barn. He turns his gaze back to the room, but you sense the subject is not truly the Greeks. It is the impossibility of peace, the burden of ruling people who see the world as a puzzle designed to be unsolved. The satrap next to you leans in again, voice barely above a whisper. One day, he says, the king will send an army to Athens. Perhaps then he will finally have silence. But you doubt it. You suspect that in the empire of Darius, the only real peace is the silence that comes when there is no one left to argue. You finish your wine, your tongue numb, your mind buzzing with questions. You do not envy the messengers, the soldiers, or the kings. Here, every goblet is a test, every conversation a minefield, every foreigner an unfinished problem. The feast continues. Darius listens, impassive, as his satraps bicker politely over nothing. The Greeks, you realize, are not the only ones who love to argue. Perhaps that is the real secret. Every empire is just another dinner party, always in danger of turning into a brawl. And somewhere, far beyond the palace, the wind picks up and carries word of Persia's irritation all the way to Athens, where the people are already planning their next noisy rebellion. The feast ebbs, though the noise of the satrap's laughter lingers in the corridors long after you escape the hall. You are guided, or perhaps herded, by another official, this one thin as a stylus and twice as precise, down a passageway lined with reliefs of men carrying scrolls and clay tablets. Here, the walls seem to close in, and the air smells of dried ink, old papyrus, and the unmistakable tang of chronic fatigue. You are led into the scribe's chamber, a place both revered and despised, depending on how recently your name appeared in one of their ledgers. There is no gold here, only stacks of wax tablets and jars of black pigment, shelves groaning under the weight of stories, taxes, confessions, and the official list of who sat where and said what at which banquet. The chief scribe, who looks as if he was born hunched over a desk, nods to you. He is surrounded by a flock of junior scribes, all of whom are young, pale, and trembling, their hands perpetually stained with ink and fear. You have heard that in Persia, a scribe's handshake is considered suspiciously soft, and here you see why. They spend their lives clutching reed pens and praying for short speeches. The chief scribe fixes you with a sharp, bloodshot eye. You are here to understand how we remember, he says, as though you have been summoned for a confession. In the empire, forgetting is a punishable offense. Every word, every order, every sigh, if it happens in the palace, it finds its way onto a tablet. He gestures to a mountain of records. This is the Book of Kings, or at least a draft. Everything the king says, does, or commands, recorded. The great deeds, of course, but also the small ones. If a fly lands in the king's wine, it is written. If the king sneezes, it is written. If the king changes his mind, we write both the old and the new thought, with a note explaining why the change was wise. You watch a scribe laboring over a particularly long scroll, pausing every so often to flex cramped fingers. His neighbor copies, then recopies the same sentence. You realize with a shudder that here time itself is captured and pinned like an insect. Errors are not corrected, but cataloged. Mistakes are part of the record, the chief scribe notes grimly, so the next man will know how not to repeat them, though he always does. A younger scribe, perhaps no older than 16, looks up from his task. Sometimes we must write the same event 3 times, he whispers, once as it happened, once as the king wished it had happened, and once as it will be told in the provinces. He glances around nervously, as though worried even his honesty will be transcribed. You are handed a tablet, its surface covered with tiny wedges. The scribe invites you to try your hand. Your first mark is awkward, your second worse. The stylus slips, leaving an ugly blot. You flush, but the scribe only nods sympathetically. No man is born a scribe, he says, but any man can die as one. It just takes enough mistakes. Nearby, a scribe coughs and rubs his hand, the knuckles swollen from years of ring and rewriting the day's events. We do not sleep much, he says, his smile both proud and tragic. If the king is awake, so are we. If the king dreams, we write what he dreams, even if we have to invent the dreams ourselves. You begin to understand that memory in Persia is not a private matter. It is a communal labor, a great act of copying and recopying, ensuring that nothing is ever truly forgotten, even the things everyone would prefer to erase. A king may be immortal in stone, but he is truly eternal only in ink. As you turn to leave, the chief scribe stops you. Remember, he says, to be forgotten here is the worst fate of all. Better 1,000 mistakes, 1,000 humiliations, than to vanish from the record. Only the unrecorded truly die. You step back into the corridor, the scratching of reed pens still echoing in your mind. You realize that in the shadow of Darius, every life is a line in the Book of Kings, and even your smallest failure may someday be recounted, revised, miscopied, retold by men who have never seen your face and will never care about your story. Somewhere behind you, a scribe yawns and returns to his task, ready to record the next breath the empire takes. It is impossible to pass long in the palace without being pulled, sooner or later, into the orbit of the priests. You sense their approach before you see them, a faint whiff of incense, a murmur of prayers in a language older than the empire itself, and the slow, deliberate shuffling of feet that are never in a hurry, because eternity is always waiting. You are led, this time by a junior official who looks half terrified and half bored, into a shadowy hall lined with fire altars. The air here is thicker, sharper, almost electric. The torches do not flicker, yet the shadows on the walls seem alive, crawling up and down the stone with every whispered word. A group of priests stand in a loose circle, their white robes glowing dimly in the half light, their faces a mask of practiced solemnity. The high priest stands at the center, ancient and severe, eyes so black you wonder if they are windows or mirrors. He regards you not as a guest, nor even a subject, but as a small problem to be diagnosed and, perhaps, someday, solved. You are curious, he states, not asks. Curiosity is a kind of fire. It can illuminate, but also burn. His voice is soft, but carries, as if the stone itself has been trained to listen. You are surrounded by signs of Zoroastrianism, the sacred fire never allowed to die, the table of ritual bread and water, the banners depicting the eternal struggle between light and darkness. A priest recites a prayer, slow, steady, the syllables like stones dropped into a well. You try to listen, but the words slide off your mind, slippery with age and repetition. Here, says the high priest, gesturing to the fire, we guard what cannot be rebuilt. The world is a battlefield between order and chaos, truth and the lie. Even the King of Kings is only a general in this war. He says this with such certainty that you believe him, even though you have not seen much order lately, only the chaos of too many laws and too little mercy. Another priest joins in, explaining the ritual. The fire burns so that we remember darkness is always waiting. To let the flame die is to invite the end of the world, or at least the end of your place in it. You nod, unsure whether this is metaphor or simple workplace advice. It occurs to you that no one here is at peace, least of all the king. Darius is a distant presence in this hall, but he is everywhere, invoked in every prayer and curse alike. You hear his name paired with Ahura Mazda, as if the king and the god are only separated by a few well chosen words and 1,000 anxious dreams. A younger priest, eyes wide from too many sleepless nights, tells you about the king's insomnia. Darius cannot sleep, he confides. When he closes his eyes, he sees all the fires of the empire, every hearth, every altar, every torch. He fears that if he sleeps, the darkness will take one. So he stays awake, and so do we. You imagine it, the king pacing the marble halls at midnight, haunted not by his enemies, but by the thought that somewhere, in some forgotten corner of his empire, the flame has died. Sleep, you realize, is not just dangerous for kings. It is treason against vigilance. The king cannot afford to close his eyes. Not when his priests teach that every moment of inattention is an invitation to ruin. The high priest looks at you again, his gaze now almost kind. You wonder why we worship fire, he asks. Because it is never satisfied. It is hungry, impatient, beautiful, and terrifying. Like all good kings, it must be watched at all times. You cannot decide if this is meant as comfort or warning. As you are led from the hall, you pass a group of junior priests huddled together, trading rumors of omens, bad dreams, and the recent shortages of pure incense. You overhear one say, "If the king sleeps, who will watch for the darkness?" Another responds, "Let him sleep. The rest of us need the rest more than he does." You step back into the day, blinking at the sudden, indifferent sunlight. For a moment, you long for the shadowy calm of the temple, where at least fear has the dignity of ritual and the darkness is not quite so lonely. Yet you understand now, in this empire, sleep is not rest, but surrender, and even the most powerful man in the world is kept awake by the fires he himself demanded never go out. The sun, indifferent as ever, hangs overhead as you are guided out of the smoky depths of the priest's domain and back into the shifting glare of Persepolis. You are led through a series of courtyards, each one more ornate, more carefully manicured, and somehow more desolate than the last, toward the great Apadana, the audience hall of columns, where the king receives the world. You enter, and for a moment, the scale overwhelms you. The hall stretches out, vast and echoing, the air as cool as if it belonged to another world. Columns as thick as ancient trees rise up in ranks, each one carved with images of men carrying tribute, animals in impossible poses, and kings, always kings, watching, always watching. You try to count the columns, but quickly lose track. The space between each one is wide enough for a procession of elephants, and you suspect that has happened more than once. The ceiling seems impossibly high, as if the builders wanted to make a point about the distance between you and the gods, or perhaps the distance between you and the King of Kings. Darius appears, silent as a shadow, walking between the columns as if they are old friends. He does not hurry. Here, he does not need to. This is his masterpiece, his vision made stone. He gestures for you to follow, and you do, your footsteps swallowed by the sheer emptiness of the hall. "Do you know who built this?" he asks, not expecting an answer. "Not Persians, not Medes, not even Babylonians. I brought stonemasons from Egypt, carpenters from Lydia, jewelers from India. Men who hated each other learned to work together because I told them to." He stops by a relief showing a line of foreign craftsmen, their faces worn by travel, their hands heavy with tools. "This hall is a promise," he says, almost to himself, "a promise that here, in this place, the world itself is bent into order. Men who would never have spoken a kind word to each other build together for the king. That is power." You walk on, your eyes darting to each new scene carved into the stone. There are lions, of course, and bulls, and processions of men bearing gifts. The gifts are always grand, always excessive: ivory, gold, tapestries, and once a leopard on a chain. You realize that the art here is not simply decoration, but propaganda in stone, a record of obedience and of the expectation that obedience will continue forever. Yet there is something else in the hall, something no craftsman intended. It is a silence that settles in the spaces between the columns, a coldness that has nothing to do with the shade. You look at Darius, who stands surrounded by the beauty and might of the world, and you see that his eyes are not on the reliefs, but on the empty air. In this hall, built to gather the world, the King of Kings stands alone. He senses your gaze and offers you a rare private smile, thin, tired, almost human. Every column stands apart, he says. If you put them too close, the roof will fall. If you put them too far, the roof will never rise. Such is empire. Every man is needed, every man kept at just the right distance. You nod, not sure if you are expected to respond. You think of the craftsmen, each one a stranger in this land, carving their skills into stone they will never own, building a hall they will likely never see finished. They too were kept at a distance, united only by the will of a man who needed them, but never quite trusted them. A servant enters, bowing low, and offers Darius a clay tablet. He glances at it, sighs, and tucks it away in his robe. Another report, he says. Always another report. The world is very large, and so very good at finding new ways to go wrong. He looks at you, his gaze sharp once more. Remember this, he says quietly. A king may build a hall so vast the world can stand within it, but he will always find himself alone between the columns. He turns and walks away, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. You linger a moment longer, staring up at the impossible ceiling, feeling the chill of something you cannot quite name. At last, you leave the hall, blinking in the sudden glare. Outside, the courtyards bustle with life, servants running errands, guards pretending not to eavesdrop, foreign dignitaries feigning awe. Yet you carry with you the silence of the Apadana and the image of a king surrounded by the world, yet unreachable as the sky. You wonder, as you are led away, how many halls Darius must build before he finds one in which he is not alone. The hall of columns recedes behind you, but the echo of its emptiness lingers in your bones. You are led into a smaller, yet still resplendent, receiving chamber. The ceilings are lower here, carved and painted in dizzying geometric patterns, and the air is heavy with the mingled scents of sandalwood and sweat. This is a place of business, of bargains, of long silences, broken only by the clinking of jewelry or the quiet hiss of parchment being unrolled. Here, the world comes to Persia. Ambassadors and emissaries from distant lands gather in cautious clusters, each draped in the finest cloth their treasuries can spare. Some stare openly, overwhelmed by the weight of Persian gold and the even heavier weight of Persian expectation. Others look everywhere but at the throne, rehearsing their speeches in languages that sound to you like riddles being asked by nervous ghosts. Darius enters, his presence more palpable than any jeweled crown. He settles onto a throne, inlaid with gold and lapis, flanked by guards whose eyes are as unblinking as the statues behind them. The king does not need to speak to command silence. He is silence, and the room falls into it. A servant, his movements as careful as a man carrying hot coals, steps forward with a long scroll. Gifts, he announces, from the corners of the earth. One by one, the ambassadors approach. From India comes a basket of jewels, each stone so brilliant you wonder if they are meant to dazzle or blind. From Egypt, a golden statue of a cat, its eyes glittering with emerald, its posture haughty and resigned. From Lydia, bolts of cloth dyed a purple so deep it seems to swallow the torchlight. From the Black Sea, a small, nervous man offers a caged falcon, which regards the proceedings with almost comical disdain. Each gift is examined, weighed, sometimes literally, and catalogued by a cadre of scribes. There is a ritual to it, as there is to all things in Persia. The king accepts, the scribe records, the ambassador bows, and somewhere in a distant city, a village calculates what it will have to sacrifice next year to match this offering. As you watch, it occurs to you that gifts here are less about generosity than about survival. The gold and jewels do not enrich the king so much as test his patience. Each offering is a coded message. Here is what we value. Here is what we think you want. Here is what we hope you will let us keep. Darius addresses the room, his voice as smooth and cold as the marble beneath your feet. Gold, he says, is a poor substitute for loyalty, but it weighs more easily. A ripple of nervous laughter passes among the ambassadors, each unsure if they have given enough or too much. An envoy from a northern tribe, his beard crusted with frost, presents a cloak sewn from the pelts of animals you cannot name. Darius inspects it, nods, and gestures for the man to speak. Great king, the envoy says, his accent thick and wary, my people offer you warmth for the winter. Darius smiles, a rare thin thing, and replies, in Persia, winter is not the enemy, memory is. The room is still. You sense that everyone is trying to puzzle out whether this is a compliment or a warning. After the last gift is received, Darius motions to a scribe who reads a list of reciprocal offerings. Bolts of fine cloth, jars of honey, horses bred on the royal pastures. But you notice that what Persia gives in return is always less than what it takes. This, you realize, is the true cost of tribute, to be thanked for your gifts and to know, with absolute certainty, that you will give more next time. The ambassadors murmur their farewells, clutching empty hands and full anxieties. You catch snippets of conversation in half a dozen languages, plans for better gifts, complaints about the heat, cautious admiration for the king's restraint. As the chamber empties, Darius remains seated, his eyes fixed on the treasure now stacked at his feet. For a moment, he looks not triumphant, but tired, as if every jewel is a burden, every ingot of gold another link in an invisible chain. You realize, with a pang of something that might be pity, that even kings are prisoners, bound by the expectations of a world that never stops asking for more. A scribe records the last of the gifts. You watch as he glances at the king, then at you, then quickly away. The scroll is rolled, the chamber cleared, and once again you are left standing in the quiet aftermath of Persian power, a wealth so vast it leaves even the most generous man with nothing he can truly call his own. You are led out, your footsteps softened by carpets thick enough to bury the sound of regret. Behind you, the king's treasury grows heavier, and you wonder how much longer it can bear the weight of the world. The palace at night is a study in excess. You are invited, perhaps summoned, perhaps simply swept along in the tide of protocol to a royal feast. This is not an event so much as an ordeal. The great tables, stretching the length of a canal, are covered with dishes so ornate you are afraid to touch them, lest you set off some trap reserved for the unwary. Candelabras flicker, shadows leap, and the laughter of satraps and dignitaries echoes like the clatter of coins in a counting room. Servants weave between the guests, bearing platters stacked with delicacies that have traveled further than most of the people eating them. Grapes from Egypt, honey cakes from Sogdiana, spiced meats from Anatolia, each bite a reminder that the King of Kings does not conquer for glory alone, but for a broader menu. You are placed at a table near the end, close enough to see Darius when he enters, but far enough to be a safe distance from any real decision. Around you, men and women of all ranks attempt the delicate art of not offending anyone more powerful than themselves. A single word, an ill timed laugh, or a failure to bow at the right angle might cost you a lifetime's worth of dinners. The food arrives in waves, 32 dishes in all, each announced by a servant whose voice grows duller with each repetition. You sample what you can, though you notice many guests do little more than move food around their plates, eyes darting from dish to taster and back. You realize, with a tightening in your gut, that every course is a test, not of appetite, but of caution. The Poisoners Guild is legendary here, and it is said that to be a taster in Persia is to live one heartbeat at a time. Each dish is sampled first by a servant who waits a prescribed span, counted not by sand or water, but by the length of a verse recited by a nearby scribe. If the servant survives, the dish is deemed fit for kings and lesser mortals alike. Still, no one truly relaxes. You see men turn pale at the sight of unfamiliar herbs. Women trade quiet glances as a new wine is poured. In the world of Darius, safety is always relative, and trust comes only after the plate is empty and the servants remain standing. At the high table, Darius presides with a grim humor. He listens to the arguments and boasts of his satraps, nodding or raising an eyebrow as required. Yet his attention drifts, now and then, toward a servant who stands at his elbow with a parchment. You notice the king's finger tapping a spot on the list, a name, a province, perhaps a dish best avoided. He seems almost bored, as if the true feast happens somewhere beyond reach in the endless logistics of empire. The talk around you turns to the royal road. Someone boasts of riding from Sardis to Susa in less than 2 weeks, prompting skeptical laughter and stories of bandits, floods, and officials whose greatest pleasure is inventing new taxes for tired travelers. Another guest, eyes bright with wine or bravado, declares the road the longest in the world, for no other highway requires so many bribes to travel its length. A satrap nearby leans over and, in a tone just above a whisper, tells you that the road is the king's greatest invention and his greatest worry. It brings tribute to Persepolis, but it brings news just as quickly, he says. Some days I think the road is not for the king's glory, but for the speed of his anxieties. You nod, unsure if you are meant to agree or simply to acknowledge the existence of worry as a basic fact of imperial life. The conversation drifts, as it always does, to the reliability of couriers. You hear tales of men who ride through sandstorms and snow, who memorize messages so sensitive that they cannot be written down, and who, if captured, are expected to forget everything before they are made to speak. It occurs to you that here, memory is both currency and curse. Remember too much, and you are dangerous. Remember too little, and you are dead. A lull settles over the table as yet another round of dishes is cleared, each one carefully tested, each survivor greeted with a sigh of relief. Darius stands and raises a goblet. To the road, he says, which brings us gifts and complaints in equal measure. There is laughter, forced but unanimous, and you drink, tasting more fear than wine. When the feast ends, guests depart in small, careful groups, each pausing to thank the king or his shadow. You linger, watching servants gather the untouched food, the uneaten fruit, the remnants of a meal designed more to display the empire's power than to nourish its guests. You make your way out, passing a row of tired tasters, each one alive for another night, each one watching you with the hollow eyes of those who have survived more banquets than any man should. As you leave the echoing hall, the laughter and fear fade behind you, and all that remains is the memory of dishes you dared not finish and the road you will one day have to travel. In Persia, even a feast is another kind of trial, and survival is measured in courses, not years. After the ordeal of the feast, you seek air in the palace gardens. The evening is cool and heavy, with the scent of flowering trees brought from as far as Bactria and Lydia, their roots coaxed to live together by the quiet threat of royal disapproval. Peacocks strut along pebble paths, looking as if they expect to be recorded in a scribe's ledger at any moment. Somewhere nearby, a fountain chatters to itself, perhaps rehearsing a list of grievances for the next ambassador. You are not alone for long. A satrap joins you, his robes stiff with sea salt, his expression as sour as if he's just bitten into an unripe pomegranate. The king wishes you to hear of the fleet, he begins, as if there is no finer subject for digestion than ships and shipwrecks. You listen, trying not to betray ignorance of the sea. The satrap speaks with the aggrieved patience of a man who has argued with both the ocean and the treasury and lost to both. You think Persia is a land of sand and stone, yes? He says. But the king dreams of water. He dreams of ships that move faster than news, of harbors busier than Babylon's gates. He leads you down a path where young cypresses, barely taller than a man, are staked upright with ropes, each one a promise, each one a wager against the wind. The king commands us to build a fleet. We build it. The king commands us to sail. We sail when we can. And when we cannot, we send reports to the palace explaining why the sea is a less reliable subject than Lydia or Egypt. He pauses by a bed of irises, their colors bruised by dusk. We have shipwrights from Phoenicia, rowers from Egypt, captains from Ionia. Every province sends us wood, pitch, or men who claim to know which end of a ship is the front. When the wind is kind and the gods inattentive, we send squadrons out to patrol the coasts and remind the world that even Poseidon must bow to the King of Kings. But you sense the shadow behind his words. The satrap lowers his voice, and his bitterness grows more pronounced. The truth, the sea is a traitor. You can command an army. You can bribe a border. You can even, on a lucky day, outwait a revolt. But the sea laughs at every command, ignores every threat. Half our fleet has been sunk by storms or grounded by rocks no one bothered to chart. The sailors are braver than the generals, or more foolish, and every campaign ends with the treasury wondering if it is better to fight the Greeks or just hope they drown before reaching our shores. He gestures toward the far end of the garden, where you realize the sweet scent of jasmine cannot fully mask the salt of disappointment. We build because the king commands it. We build knowing the sea will unbuild. It is a Persian tradition. If something falls, rebuild it. If it falls again, record the cost and try a third time. Eventually, someone will call it success. You share a moment of silent accord, the satrap and you both aware that in Persia, what matters is not what survives, but what is attempted with sufficient spectacle. The king's fleet may sink 100 times, but the story will be told as if every ship returned home loaded with gold. The satrap sighs. Perhaps one day the king will command the wind itself. Until then, we count the losses, praise the survivors, and prepare the next ship for its first and likely last voyage. You walk together back toward the palace, and he leaves you at a colonnade that smells faintly of tar and regret. There, a group of couriers argue over routes along the royal road, each one claiming his way is shorter, safer, less likely to end in disaster. You see that travel, whether by sea or land, is always a negotiation with fate. As the stars blink over Persepolis, you wonder how many ships will be built before the king accepts the sea's answer. And you realize, in Persia, defeat is never final, so long as it is carefully forgotten and replaced by a new, better funded attempt. You slip into the palace shadows, where the stories of ships and sailors and loss will be rewritten tomorrow, and the king's dream of empire, like the fleet, floats onward, always on the verge of sinking, but never quite permitted to rest. You are beginning to suspect that in Persia, even the peacocks are spies. It is not paranoia if everyone is watching, and everywhere you walk in the palace, you feel the gentle prickle of unseen attention. The night brings no comfort. Torches flicker in the corridors, their shadows as restless as the men they illuminate. You find yourself led, not asked, not invited, into yet another chamber, one that smells of dust, candle wax, and the faint, nervous sweat of men who know too much and share too little. Inside, the atmosphere is strangely hushed. Courtiers and officials speak in low tones, each careful not to let a single word echo. In one corner, a scribe with a crooked nose quietly copies a list of names onto a thin slip of parchment. In another, a man in nondescript robes sits with a clay tablet balanced on his knee, his eyes fixed on the door even as his hand moves without pause. These are the king's watchers, the eyes and ears, as the whispers go, Persia's living network of intelligence, distrust, and careful record keeping. You are introduced to a certain official who never gives his name and never asks for yours. His title is as vague as his smile. You may call me a listener, he says, although he looks as though he has never truly listened to anyone in his life. In the empire, silence is a resource more precious than gold. He gestures for you to sit on a cushion so thin it could almost be a joke. We listen, he explains. We record. We observe. The king wishes to know not only what his satraps say in his presence, but what they whisper in the dark, what they hide in their letters, what they dare to dream when no one is watching. There are no secrets in Persia, only secrets that have not yet been discovered. You try to relax, but every question feels like a test with no right answer. How does one become an ear, you ask, and the listener grins. One never volunteers. One is noticed for being quiet, then promoted for being quieter. The loudest man in the room is always the easiest to follow. He produces a stack of small tablets, each marked with hasty script. These are reports from the provinces, news of grain harvests, tax disputes, suspected plots, the love affairs of minor governors. We sift the urgent from the unimportant. Sometimes it is hard to tell the difference. What seems like gossip today may be a rebellion next year, or a reason to celebrate if the right man is caught. Another watcher enters, speaking in hurried whispers. A courier in Parthian dress has been delayed, the road muddy and impassable. He says he was attacked by bandits, the watcher reports, but his wounds are oddly clean. The listener nods, making a mental note. No detail too small for suspicion. You learn that the king's spies are everywhere and nowhere, sometimes disguised as merchants, sometimes as priests, and often as themselves. Their power lies not in violence, but in the gentle pressure of uncertainty. The best spy, the listener says, never needs to deliver a report. His presence alone changes the outcome. There are rewards for information, of course, favors, protection, sometimes even a quiet promotion to a better sort of obscurity. But the punishments are more memorable. If you are caught knowing too much, the listener murmurs, you are forgotten by everyone but us. If you know too little, you may live a long life, so long as you never start asking questions. The night grows deeper, the silence more oppressive. You realize that in Persia, privacy is a kind of treason, and innocence is just another mask for ignorance. The listener leans forward, his face half shadowed. What do you know? He asks. You answer carefully, knowing your words will outlive you in some dusty archive. Not enough to be dangerous, you say. He smiles, a slow and unsettling thing. That is the only safe answer. Keep it. As you are dismissed, you step out into the corridor, the weight of invisible eyes pressing at your back. You understand now, in this empire, survival is not about bravery or cleverness, but about being exactly interesting enough to remember and just dull enough to be ignored. You move on, grateful for the shadows, and more grateful still that you are not a watcher, only watched. The listener's parting smile lingers behind your eyes as you are led, this time by a young official who manages to look both bored and terrified, into a chamber lined with maps. This room is smaller than the others, but it feels crowded, not with people, but with possibilities. Every wall is covered with parchment and painted wood, each surface littered with scrolls and tablets marked with names you can barely pronounce. You pause at the threshold, momentarily overwhelmed. In the empire of Darius, even geography is suspect. The maps are not simply pictures of land and river, they are arguments, accusations, threats written in ink. Here a city has been added, there a province erased. Mountains shift slightly from map to map, like sullen children in a family portrait. You understand, with a sudden sense of dread, that a map in this palace is never simply a record of the world as it is, but a suggestion of how it might be redrawn. The chief cartographer, an elderly man with more ink than blood in his veins, greets you without looking up from his desk. Another visitor, he mutters, as if you are just another hill to be moved. Sit, do not touch the red ink. You obey. The old man's fingers are permanently stained, and the air around him smells of glue and disappointment. He gestures to the map before him, a tangled mess of lines, rivers, and names. This is the empire today, he says, or at least this morning. By evening, it will change again. The king believes that order can be drawn with a ruler, but the world, I assure you, is more of a spilled jar of ink. You glance at the parchment, noting the endless parade of cities: Susa, Babylon, Ecbatana, Sardis, faraway Bactra, names that taste foreign even as you say them in your mind. How do you remember them all? You ask. The cartographer sighs. No one remembers them all. Even the king forgets sometimes. When he does, we erase a name. It is easier to erase a city from a map than to rebuild it after a revolt. A junior scribe brings over a stack of clay tablets, each one covered in yet more names. Each of these is a village, the scribe whispers, or was last year. The cartographer smiles, thin and sad. Some villages change their names to avoid taxes. Some are renamed after the king's favorite horse. Some are erased by the wind, others by the army. You realize with a kind of weary awe that in this palace, geography is less a science than a form of politics. To be on the map is both blessing and curse. You are counted, taxed, noticed, maybe even protected. To disappear from the map is to vanish, not only from the king's sight, but from memory itself. Sometimes, the best defense against invasion is obscurity. The cartographer stands, stretching creaky bones. Once a year, we hold a census. The king wants to know how many subjects he has, how much land, how many sheep. It is an impossible task. The world does not stand still for counting. He taps a city, then draws a line through it. That one rebelled last spring. Gone now, but the river remains, as rivers do. The river cares nothing for kings. On another wall hangs a massive wooden board covered in pins and scraps of ribbon. Here, the cartographer explains, are the roads. They connect everything, at least in theory. In practice, some roads lead nowhere, some vanish in the rains, some are guarded by men who charge more than the king's tax collectors. The king's map and the traveler's map, two very different worlds. A scribe quietly amends a list, erasing one village and adding another. We change names to keep the king happy, he whispers. Sometimes we invent a town if a satrap needs to explain missing taxes. Sometimes we lose one if there are too many names for one province. You look closer and realize that some of the names Derpesky are written in red ink, others in black. Red is for places the king wishes to remember, the cartographer murmurs. Black is for places he prefers to forget. There is a kind of power here that you had not considered before. The power to erase with a stroke, to redraw borders with a breath. The king's greatest weapon is not the sword or the spear, but the stylus and the brush. The map is a battlefield, and every town is a potential casualty. You thank the cartographer, who grunts in response, already lost in the next revision. As you step into the corridor, the world seems both larger and smaller than before, an endless landscape of names that may or may not exist, pinned to parchment in a room where the empire's future is quietly erased and redrawn each day. You leave, feeling as though you too might one day vanish, not with a cry or a battle, but with a quiet swipe of a brush, your name replaced by another, your story folded into the endless geography of Persian ambition. If the maps are where the empire is drawn and redrawn, the courtroom is where it is measured, judged, and, when necessary, quietly dismantled. You are led, this time by a man whose title shifts depending on who is listening, into the heart of Darius's justice, a hall wide as a river, thick with the scent of sweat and old papyrus. The courtroom is crowded, but silence rules here more absolutely than the King of Kings himself. Guards stand at attention, petty nobles fidget in their robes, scribes perch on low stools, styluses ready to record everything except the obvious truths. You find a place at the back and try to look like someone with nothing to lose. Today, a minor official is on trial, a grain accountant from a distant satrapy. His crime, it is alleged, is the disappearance of several wagon loads of barley, vanished between the field and the treasury. The accused is thin, gray, and desperately ordinary, which is a dangerous condition in Persia. He stands, head bowed, as the satrap overseeing the trial begins the recitation of charges: theft, incompetence, dereliction, disrespect, and worst of all, wasting the king's time. You listen as witness after witness is called: a farmer who delivered the barley, a guard who swears that he saw nothing unusual, a scribe who claims the ledger was always in order until, suddenly, it was not. Each gives testimony with the weary tone of one who knows that justice here is less about truth than about performance. The court, you realize, is a kind of theater where everyone plays a part. The outcome is less a question of guilt and more a test of stamina. 7 hours pass. No one leaves. Even the king's absence is a presence, felt in the careful way everyone avoids mentioning his name. Outside, the sun crosses the sky, but within the court, time is rationed by the weight of each testimony, the scraping of each reed pen. The judge, chosen, you suspect, for his ability to stay awake, listens, asks questions, and occasionally interrupts to demand that a witness repeat a particularly vague answer. Nothing is ever clarified, only repeated in greater detail. You notice that the scribe never stops writing. Every word, every sigh, every cough is recorded. You wonder who will read these records, who will care about the story of a grain thief in a province most courtiers cannot even find on a map. Perhaps that is the point. No detail is too small for the king's justice, no man too ordinary to be made an example. At last, the satrap rises. He does not ask for a verdict, he delivers one. The accused is guilty of something. The punishment is exile or reassignment, or a fine so large that only his descendants will know its true cost. You realize that the only real crime here was being noticed at the wrong moment. As the court empties, you see the faces of the spectators: relief from those whose names were not called, disappointment from those who had hoped for a harsher sentence, and the weary acceptance of men who know that justice is just another kind of waiting. The scribes remain, stacking tablets and sorting the evidence into piles labeled guilty, innocent, and to be decided later. You are left with a sense of time as the true currency of the court. The longer the trial, the more important it is assumed to be. The more people kept waiting, the more impressive the judgment. Here, time does not belong to the accused or even to the judge. Time belongs to the king, and he spends it as he pleases. Outside, the sun is lower in the sky. You pass the accused in the hallway, now stripped of his insignia, his eyes fixed on some distant horizon only he can see. He does not look at you or at anyone else. In Persia, the final verdict is not guilt or innocence, but erasure. To be forgotten is the harshest sentence of all. You walk away, the echo of 7 hours ringing in your ears. In the empire of Darius, you have learned the scales of justice are balanced not with gold or grain, but with the patience of those who dare to wait and the indifference of those who rule the clock. After the court has emptied, you are led once more through the corridors of Persepolis. By now, you no longer wonder where you are going. You know that in the palace, direction is an illusion. Every path is a loop, every corridor leads eventually back to the throne, and in every room exists for a reason that is only clear in hindsight. You find yourself in a part of the palace you have not seen before, or perhaps you have, but it has changed its shape overnight. The walls here are less ornate, more practical, but still impossibly smooth, with doors that seem to multiply when you are not looking. The ceilings are lower, the air denser, the light caught and held by draperies that muffle both sound and ambition. Your guide, this time a chamberlain with a limp and the haunted eyes of a man who has memorized too many passwords, offers a wan smile. His Majesty is fond of building, he says, with a shrug that is equal parts pride and apology. If the empire is to last forever, so must the walls. If the walls fall, at least there will be another set behind them. You pass through anterooms filled with foreign carpets, side chambers lined with unused scrolls, and galleries where the portraits of satraps and generals stare down with varying degrees of self-importance and concealed terror. A new palace for each season, the chamberlain explains, or for each mood. The king is a man of many moods. In one sunlit hall, artisans from as far away as India chip away at blocks of marble, their tools ringing faintly through the quiet. In a shadowy passage, stonemasons from Egypt whisper in a language no one else can follow, surrounded by columns that will never see the light of day. A royal architect, his hands permanently coated in dust, greets you and then immediately begins a heated argument with a surveyor about the width of a secret passage. Every new palace is a maze, the architect tells you, not pausing for breath. We design escape routes for the king, rooms that no map records, spaces where no one but his majesty and a trusted servant may enter. Today, a hall for receiving tribute. Tomorrow, a hidden garden for plotting revolts against boredom, if nothing else. You notice that some rooms have no clear entrance, while others are marked only by a painted symbol, a lion's paw, a stylized arrow, the curve of a falcon's beak. These are not labels, the architect whispers, but reminders. Every room is built with a reason and a secret, and sometimes the secret is that there is no reason at all. You are led into a chamber with walls so thick that even the cries from the courtyards cannot penetrate. The chamberlain closes the door and looks at you with the tired patience of someone who has waited out many monarchs. The king likes to wander at night, he confides. He does not sleep, as you may have heard. He walks these halls, alone or with a single guard, and every so often he orders a new room, a place to hide, a place to rest, a place to vanish when the throne becomes too heavy. Sometimes I think he is more a prisoner of his own palaces than any man he has ever conquered. You stand in silence, feeling the layers of stone around you, walls built for safety, then for secrecy, then for paranoia, until no one can say how many palaces stand within the palace. The king's footsteps are said to echo differently in every hall, a code only he understands. The chamberlain nods to a locked door at the far end. There are rooms here no one enters, not even the king anymore. When power changes hands, a new room is built and an old one forgotten. That is how empires last, not by remembering everything, but by burying what cannot be spoken in stone. You are shown out through a back passage, your head spinning with the weight of all you have seen and all you have not. You realize that in Persepolis, architecture is not merely about protection or beauty. It is the physical record of every king's fear and ambition, a maze designed not only to impress, but to confuse, confound, and occasionally to hide. As you return to the more familiar parts of the palace, you look back once, half expecting the door to vanish. In Persia, you think, every palace is a fortress, every fortress a labyrinth, and every labyrinth a confession of a ruler's deepest doubts. The further you wander from the throne, the more muted the palace becomes. Eventually, you find yourself at the edge of a small courtyard where music, of all things, drifts through the dusk. The notes are soft, minor, and oddly cautious, like the sound of hope apologizing for existing. A cluster of musicians sits on a raised platform, surrounded by clusters of reeds and flickering lamps. Their instruments are elegant but battered, showing the marks of travel and many hasty packings. The leader, a man whose beard is as gray as his eyes, plucks a slow lament from a harp strung with gut. The others follow, their pipes and lutes weaving a pattern of regret more intricate than any carpet in the palace. You linger at the edge, unseen for a moment, listening as their song turns on itself, refusing resolutely to become joyful. Now and then, a stray note hints at something brighter, but each time it is cut short, as if joy were not only unlikely, but forbidden. A servant, carrying a platter of fruit and nuts, leans close and mutters, "Play anything too cheerful, and the chief steward will have you replaced with a statue. The king has no time for happiness." You nod as if this is a normal state of affairs. In Persia, the price of every emotion is set by the court, and laughter costs more than it is worth. You watch as a young flutist, barely old enough to shave, falters for a moment and is immediately glared at by the harpist. The music resumes its somber march, more funeral than festival. Later, In the corridor behind the courtyard, you meet the leader of the musicians as he tunes his harp, the strings barely audible above the sound of your own thoughts. We are allowed to play only what will not disturb the king, he says quietly, testing a minor chord that echoes like distant thunder. No joy, no boasting, nothing that might remind his majesty of victories won or pleasures lost. You ask him, quietly, whether it has always been this way. He smiles, a sad, tired gesture. Not always. Once, in the early days, there were dances, songs that made even the soldiers tap their feet. But that was before the king's eyes turned inward, before the court became a place where every echo might be overheard by the wrong person. He glances over his shoulder, then continues. Joy is dangerous. Laughter attracts attention. If a melody makes someone remember a better time, it might make them wish for change. Safer to keep everything minor, everything longing for something that cannot be named. You realize, with a chill, that in this palace, music has become another kind of surveillance. Each note is measured, each lyric approved, each silence weighed against the risk of awakening some dangerous longing. A servant brings out a cup of watered wine for the musicians and stands guard until every drop is swallowed. No one is permitted to linger too long with the players. No one is allowed to request a favorite tune. The king's rules are clear, even if they are rarely spoken aloud. Let no one forget the cost of happiness, and let no one grow bold with hope. You notice, too, that the courtyard is watched from every side. Guards at each archway, scribes pretending to sketch the scene, but actually listening for words that stray too close to celebration. Even the peacocks seem subdued, their plumage dulled by the fading light and the music's steady, somber pull. As you turn to leave, the music shifts for a brief, unguarded moment, a single phrase of defiant sweetness that quickly vanishes into the greater tide of melancholy. You lock eyes with the young flutist, who winks and then returns to his careful, mournful scales. Back in the corridor, the air is thick with the scent of crushed violets and unshed tears. You realize that here, sorrow is safer than joy, and that the only music truly welcome is the kind that reminds the king and everyone else that hope is best left unresolved. You leave the musicians behind, their song lingering in your memory, and wonder if, in another age, the palace will remember anything but the long, slow dirge of its own suspicion. As evening deepens, you are summoned, or perhaps simply drift, up a winding stair to the palace roof. The stone under your feet still radiates the day's heat, but the air above is fresh, touched with the cool promise of night. You emerge onto a broad terrace, open to the desert winds and the burnished sky. Here, for the first time all day, there is a kind of hush, a pause that belongs to no one but the fading sun. Darius is already waiting, alone for once, leaning on the balustrade and staring west. The empire sprawls below, palaces, gardens, dusty roads vanishing into a purple horizon. For a moment, you see what he sees. A kingdom built from stone and willpower, held together by caution, gold, and the sheer exhaustion of everyone involved. He does not greet you at first, lost in thought. The silence stretches, not awkward, but deliberate, as if words themselves must be rationed after so many days spent in judgment and command. Only as the last slice of sun drops beneath the mountains does Darius finally speak. Do you know what keeps a king awake? He asks, not looking at you. It is not the Greeks, not even Babylon. It is memory. You say nothing, sensing that this is not a conversation in which your opinion matters. Darius's voice is steady, yet tired, the voice of a man who has counted too many seasons. Every evening, I come up here and I remember. I remember every man I trusted and every one I did not. Every road we built, every city we burned, every law I signed that turned good men into outlaws and clever men into satraps, he sighs. You know, memory is the true burden of the empire. Gold can be spent, armies lost, but memory only grows heavier. A gust of wind pulls at his robe, as if the desert itself wishes to interrupt. He ignores it. Do you see that village? He says, pointing at a speck far below. Once it belonged to a man who tried to cheat the tax collectors. Now it belongs to the dust. They will not sing songs about him, but I remember his name. You realize now why the scribe's records never end, why the maps are always being rewritten, why the palace is a maze of locked doors and secret rooms. All of it is memory, built into stone, written in ink, spoken in the corridors, and echoed in the songs no one is allowed to sing aloud. Darius finally turns to you, his gaze clearer and more direct than ever before. What would you choose, he asks, if you could have only one, power or peace? The question hangs between you, heavy as the dusk. You hesitate, knowing this is not a test you can pass. I do not know, my king, you say. Perhaps peace, if I understood how to find it. He laughs softly, a laugh with more shadow than light. No one knows. That is why we build walls and write laws and punish laughter. We hope the work will bring peace, but in the end, it only brings more memory. Below, you hear the distant sound of the palace settling for the night, doors closing, guards changing shifts, the last mournful echo of a minor key from the musicians in the courtyard. Somewhere in the city, another festival is beginning, but here, on the rooftop, only the king and his memories remain. Darius looks out one more time at his empire. To be king is to be alone, surrounded, yes, but alone. My power ends with me, but my memories, I fear, will haunt every stone I leave behind. The first stars blink out above the plain, indifferent to the worries of mortals. You feel a sudden kinship with the king, not as ruler and subject, but as two watchers at the edge of night, burdened by what they cannot forget. He nods toward the stair, signaling that your audience is over. Go, he says quietly. Sleep if you can. I have work yet to finish. As you leave, you glance back. The king stands motionless, his outline blurred against the night, as if even now he is not entirely part of this world. You descend the steps, carrying with you the weight of his memory and the question of whether any kingdom, no matter how vast, can ever be built strong enough to hold peace. Night at Persepolis does not so much arrive as descend, slow, inexorable, like a curtain pulled by unseen hands. You are once again summoned, this time by a guard whose eyes flick past you as if already memorizing your replacement. He leads you through halls gone suddenly silent, the laughter and argument of the day replaced by the whisper of sand on stone and the low murmur of distant watchmen. You stand once more before Darius the Great. Now, though, the audience hall is transformed. Shadows stretch and warp across the floors, torchlight flickers in nervous pools, and the gold in the walls no longer shines, but broods. Darius sits on his throne, his silhouette almost lost among the darkness, but his gaze, unmistakable, unwavering, finds you instantly. There is no hiding from the King of Kings, not even in the comfort of night. For a long moment, he simply watches you, and you feel the full weight of the empire pressing down. The roads, the armies, the endless ledgers, the prayers muttered to silent gods, the maps with their red and black ink, the palaces within palaces that never quite keep out fear or memory. You understand now that to rule is not to sleep easily, but to keep vigil, and that to be ruled is to be seen, always, from a distance that never closes. Outside, beyond the palace walls, unrest stirs. The wind carries a faint sound, a cry, a shout, the first note of what will surely become another revolt. News will reach the king soon enough, for now he sits, composed and implacable, the center of a web that stretches farther than even he can see. Darius breaks the silence, his voice lower and rougher than before. You have seen much. Tell me, what do you remember? You consider your answer carefully. Memory in this palace is both a currency and a curse. You remember the lions on the walls, always hungry, the satraps, measuring loyalty in coins and humiliation, the scribes, writing until their hands bled, the priests, forever awake in their fight against darkness, the musicians, forbidden from joy, the endless banquets, heavy with suspicion and poisoned by caution. You remember the fleet built for seas that do not wish to be crossed, and the spies who forget more than they ever reveal. But most of all, you remember Darius himself, his crooked smile, his insomnia, his relentless demand that the world remember him, even if only through the stories of his mistakes. You meet his gaze and answer quietly, I remember everything. Darius nods, unsurprised, and for a moment you wonder if this is the only victory he seeks, to be remembered, not as a god or hero, but as the king who refused to forget or be forgotten. The silence in the hall thickens. Even the torches seem to pause their flickering, waiting for something, anything, to change. Outside, the unrest swells. The king listens, and you realize he hears it all, the distant cries, the rustle of treason, the shuffle of his own memories. Yet he does not rise. He only closes his eyes for a moment, as if to rest. But you know he will not sleep. Not tonight. Perhaps not ever. History, you see, is not a thing that ends. It is a thing that begins again and again, each night, with each watchful gaze, each word scratched onto a scroll by a tired, ink stained scribe. As you leave the hall for the last time, you do not look back. The palace stretches behind you, vast and unknowable, its every stone weighed down by memory and the suspicion of revolt. The world outside is darker, the future uncertain, but you carry with you the story, the real story, of Darius the Great. Not a tale of glory or defeat, but of unending vigilance, a history that refuses to sleep, and a king who, even as unrest rises, will not look away. Tomorrow, the scribes will write another account. The satraps will send new reports. The musicians will tune their lutes to minor keys, and the spies will sharpen their silence. The king will stand his watch, and the empire, restless, hungry, awake, will begin again. And you have stood before Darius the Great and survived his gaze. That, you suspect, is as close to peace as anyone in this history will ever come.